see.
Scientists.
I love
Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. The Arab Spring that never was, almost 4 years on, it would appear the people's revolutions in the Middle East have actually only empowered the forces of reaction and resulted in extreme repression and violence. Is the Middle East doomed to be ruled by Western-backed dictators? To CrossTalk the Arab Spring, I'm joined by my guest, Nabila Ramdani in London. She is a journalist and commentator on Arab affairs. Also in London, we have Toby Cadman. He is an international criminal lawyer and serves on the board of the Syrian Commission for Justice and Accountability. And in Norman, we cross to Joshua Landis. He is director of the Center of Middle East Studies at the University of Oklahoma. All right, CrossTalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want. Toby, if I can go to you first in London, you wrote an article recently, Egypt comes full circle, the end of the Arab Spring. Why did you write it, and what does it mean?
Well, I've been following events in Egypt for some time. I joined a group of lawyers in November that was looking at documenting crimes that had occurred during the recent military coup, and then following the targeting of the Muslim Brotherhood and their supporters. We saw a court sentence 529 people to death, many of them in absentia. And as an international lawyer, I found the whole process so offensive that I thought that deserved writing about.
Nabila, should we still use the term Arab Spring or Arab Awakening? Is that appropriate anymore? Because if we go across the entire region, there's a lot of tears, to say the least.
Well, of course, the term Arab Spring, for a start, was coined by Western journalists to describe the spectacular scale of movements of protest that swept across the Middle East and North Africa 3 years ago now, and also to describe the domino effect of those protests effectively affecting one country after the other in the region, and Egypt specifically, even though the Arab Spring, the so-called Arab Spring, started in Tunisia following effectively the humiliation of a fruit seller by a police woman, a vigilante effectively, who led this fruit seller to set himself on fire. But that self-immolation was in fact the expression of frustration at the series of problems affecting the Arab world, not least of all and first and foremost, autocratic rule for decades, often in many countries, but also endemic corruption, the lack of opportunities, socio and economic opportunities, and the lack of fundamental human rights. And Egypt has effectively become the focal point. Tahrir Square has become the focal point of their hope and optimism. But it also has become the country which sums up both the success of the Arab Spring. It was swift, Mubarak was removed in 18 days, and also captures now the failure of the Arab Spring with effectively the return of a military strongman backed by a corrupt judiciary and indeed a murderous army. But it has to be said that the Arab Spring is an ongoing process. It by no means ended, and it's still going on, crucially in countries like Syria, where a civil war is still very, very much
Let me go to Joshua. Joshua, do you still like the term Arab Spring, Arab Awakening? Does it resonate with you now, considering what we've seen, particularly in Egypt, and I guess also, as Nabila pointed out, in Syria?
Well, it doesn't really anymore, and Nabila is absolutely right. The West gave it the name of Arab Spring because the West looked at this through the prism of democracy and tried to explain what broke out from Tunisia through the rest of the Arab world in terms of a desire for dignity and democracy. And of course, that wasn't a very important part, but there was a much larger story, which is the economic pressures that Nabila pointed out and the growing pains of national definition, of coming out of dynastic empire, the Ottoman Empire, and trying to develop some kind of national integrity where the nation, the people below, would actually be the sovereigns of their own destiny and of their nation and be able to decide what kind of governments. We have sort of broken halfway through that, and then we've gone to this reaction because in many ways we've seen the crumbling of very weak nation states in Libya, in Syria, in Yemen, and it's created great fear throughout the Middle East that somehow the Arab states are not going to be able to break in to this democratic fourth wave that so many people hoped it would do because of economic failures, failures of political culture. And very few people have talked about the political culture side of this. But really, I think underneath it all is an economic question of poverty, inequality, and so forth.
You know, Toby, if we could look at, we could name all the countries, but it seems like most of the elites are still in place. The deep state is it's often referred to. You can change the coloration of the landscape, but it's still the same people that it's like own the economy and benefit from the economy, and not average people.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think what both Nabil and Joshua have said is entirely correct. One of the concerns is certainly in my work looking at Syria and Egypt is looking at the economic instability, not just trying to, as Joshua said, I think look at it through the prism of democracy, but looking at how these nations can stabilize long term. I mean, I spent many years before the Arab Spring, I spent many years in Bosnia dealing with many of the same problems from an accountability perspective and rebuilding a state through economic development. And you see the collapse now in Bosnia repeating shows that we haven't learned very much in how to address many of these problems, whether you're looking at it through a process of accountability or a process of economic rebuilding. And it's regrettable that we just don't seem to learn.
You know, Nabila, Joshua pointed out, and you pointed out in the beginning, that the Arab Spring, Arab Awakening, this is a Western term. But really what's happened also is that we have political Islam on the rise as well, added with elections. And this is a complication that the West certainly doesn't understand. And as Joshua pointed out, maybe there aren't political cultures in place that can adapt to the Islamic element with the democratic and secular element. This is one of the huge stumbling blocks that we've seen over the last few years.
Well, absolutely, not just over the last few years, but if you look at, historically, Western powers have always supported so-called secular governments in Syria, for example, or indeed in Iraq. And the idea is you put a minority of people in charge of a country, and you divide and rule. And that's what's happened, fundamentally in the makeup of most countries in the Middle East following the First World War, when victorious powers effectively carved up swathes of the Middle East and to themselves, and indeed put in place those so-called secular governments. Now, of course, part and parcel of the culture of those countries is that they are fundamentally, for the vast majority of them, Muslim majority countries. So it's only right that people feel a cultural but also religious attachment to that heritage. And this, of course, following the toppling of despots, led to the expression of that culture and led to Islamic movement winning elections. And all the more so since, you have to bear in mind events like the War on Terror, where, this led to America effectively telling autocrats to repress any expression of Islam, and Muslims became, potential terrorists across the Arab world. And the takeover, if you like, of Muslim or Islamic movements post-Arab Spring has led to some dissatisfaction in Western capitals.
Joshua, how much of this is really just the end of the neo-colonial experiment the West has had for this region? Because this is also a dynamic that's being played out, as Nabila pointed out.
Well, there is that element that, as she said, that minorities were put into, were given a leg up in every one of the 11 states in particular. by the colonial powers. And today, you see the majority populations trying to overthrow them, whether it's the Shiites in Iraq overthrowing the Sunnis, the Sunni Arabs in Syria overthrowing the Alawites and other minorities, or we saw in Lebanon during the Civil War with the Muslims fighting against the Christians who had been given a lion's share of power. And still today we have Palestinians fighting against Israelis and Jews for control of Palestine. So this is a national problem of who owns the state, who really represents the nation. That's certainly in the Levant, and it's much like we saw in Eastern Europe, Central Europe, throughout the first half of the 20th century, where there was such extreme bloodshed. We're still seeing it in Crimea. Who are the real Crimeans? Are they Russians? Are they Ukrainians? Are they Tatars? And these national questions have not been decided. And in the center of it, as you say, is political Islam, and is the question of the Enlightenment, really. Is citizenship based on truth with a big T, on God and who are the chosen people who are going to go to heaven? Or is it based on citizenship of the nation, of that everybody is equal within the nation? And that there is still great disagreement about that. And we see that in the Syrian fighting, for example. Both sides are calling each other kafir, unbelievers. Mm-hmm. And not only are they unbelievers, but they don't belong to the nation, to Syria, if they don't believe in the right God. And it's very difficult to build a nation when you see the other, your opponents, your political opposites, as people who don't even belong in the country. And that leads to civil war.
Joshua, let me jump in here. We're going to go to a quick, short break. And after that break, we'll continue our discussion on the Arab Spring. Stay with RT.
I love
Governments get involved and they do dumb things, and the people in the middle are always suffering. So if they suspend anything, it's the little guy that usually gets punished. And people who run governments and the people who run big businesses and have the money, they seem to do okay on this.
No weapons. I have my own weapon, which is microphone, which I need, by the way.
Lots of people think that's exciting all the time, but in these cases you do have to wait a lot sometimes for nothing, actually.
There's so many other elements in broadcast journalists that you have to deal with. It's not just only about the story. It's you're being judged. Everything you say is being judged. How you say it is being judged. How you look, you're being judged. Where you are is being judged. All of these elements can add a lot of stress.
Welcome to the Trans-Siberian.
What are the places you'll never go to? Fun you'd never have. Things you'd never do. Experience you'll never get. Be surprised. You will.
Welcome back to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing the Arab Spring. Okay, I'd like to go back to Nabila in London. I think one of the interesting things that have happened in the last few years in the region is Saudi Arabia's role, a very reactionary regime, and it's funding quite a few people that are just as reactionary in the region. And I'm thinking of like the military government in Egypt. Of course, we have the civil war going on in Syria. But this is an important dynamic as well, Saudi Arabia's new role or growing role in political change.
Well, absolutely, and not least of all because Saudi Arabia is absolutely terrified that to see its own Arab Spring happening, and that's why it's reacting in the most reactionary and indeed repressive and autocratic manner, interfering not only, in what's happening around Saudi Arabia in the internal affairs of other countries, and it has, it is terrified, as I said, because as they've witnessed the swift change that can happen very suddenly in countries and see despots being toppled almost overnight. And that's why it's also sought to strengthen its links with Western democracies and seek further help, and not least of all in terms of military help. It has, we've seen Western powers like the UK, France, and indeed America sell vast volumes of weapons to Saudi Arabia and strengthen its business and trade links. So if Western democrats think that it's the right time to reassure an autocratic regime like Saudi Arabia, it really doesn't get the spirit of the Arab Spring.
Toby, it's very interesting because you have this regime in Riyadh and then you have Washington. It's a stressful relationship, we're told, but nonetheless it continues on. So we have Western values and we have, values coming out of Riyadh. They don't actually mix very well, do they? But that's called realism, we're told.
Yeah, it's an interesting way of putting it. I think probably the relationship is very similar with my own government here in London, because we can see now that there is, because of the steps that the Saudis have taken in relation to the Brotherhood in that part of the world, and a lot of the statements that they've issued in relation to Egypt in particular. And you can see that the relationship now with the British government in conducting what's now being called a review of the Muslim Brotherhood here in the United Kingdom. It is an uneasy relationship, but you can still see that the Saudis are using their influence on the Western powers.
Joshua, it seems to me that the Saudis and the Western powers have something in common. They don't like to say it publicly, but they would prefer to have some kind of Republican militarism in the Middle East. That's more manageable for the two sides that I'm talking about.
Well, they don't know. I think the United States is in complete confusion about what it wants in the Middle East anymore. Our main relationships are with Israel and Saudi Arabia. Both powers have wanted military leadership in Egypt, and that's been a driving force in this Arab Spring, and America has fallen in line with them, and that has confused their discourse about democracy entirely. And so we begin to look extremely hypocritical. There's no doubt about it. We're allied with the most Islamist and fundamentalist nation in the Middle East. And that, of course, so when Saudi Arabia speaks out against atheism and other political parties, the United States is confused. How do you support a pro-Western element in Syrian opposition when Saudi Arabia is in charge of funding this operation? America's not going to supply it. So America's really stepped out. They're confused. They've seen Syria, for example, become much more al-Qaeda-esque. The recent advances in the north of the country by rebels has been led by Jabhat al-Nusra, the al-Qaeda element. And the United States is for the rebels, and yet at the same time it's against al-Qaeda, and it's completely confused. And that has, I think, led to America withdrawing from the region.
Okay, Nabila, I mean,
that leads us, it's hard to say.
It's hard to say. Nabila, look at the outside forces, particularly the Western powers. I mean, they drew all these boundaries in the first place. Have they acted responsibly? Because as Joshua points out, you get very different messages. You have democracy promotion, but you have to protect Israel. And then you have Saudi Arabia, which I don't think anybody really knows what to do with anymore because they have enormous wealth in the city of London, in the United States. And there's plenty of people in the West that just want to turn a blind eye to their activities when it's so contradictory almost on every single front.
Well, yes, absolutely. And as Joshua rightly said, what the Arab Spring did is bring into sharp focus the ambiguous and indeed hypocritical relationship between Western governments and the Arab world. And America's foreign policy in particular is interesting because Obama's first and foremost aim is to maintain America's interests in the Arab world in particular. But he has actually trying to find a balance between achieving that and indeed while actually retreating as much as possible, which led to very muddled policies in the Arab world and indeed confused one, as Joshua said, and effectively led to the status quo, as we've seen in Egypt. You know, America is still funding the military and effectively supporting a murderous army, and a stable militarized Egypt is good to reassure Israel. Libya was the closest that the Americans, intervened, in fact, and it has led to now a very controversial intervention in a country now ruled by militias, which are destabilizing not only and threatening Libyan lives, but also lives in other countries in the region. And as far as the Middle East peace process is concerned, for example, Palestinian territories are still very much under Israeli occupation. Gaza is more than ever an open-air prison, and indeed America is not firm at all about freezing the settlements, illegal settlements, which are the major stumbling block to finding a peaceful solution. And let's not forget that a peaceful settlement of the Middle East process and the resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is also a guarantee for stability and peace in the whole of the region.
Toby, we've gone so far over the last few years to go essentially nowhere, it would seem.
I think that's quite right. And I think both of what Nabila and Joshua said is completely right when we're talking about confused politics and our capitals not really knowing how to address some of these problems. So looking at Syria in particular, that we have unfortunately very, very confused Western capitals knowing what to do, how to provide support, whether intervention is justified. And it has become a very, very difficult situation, knowing really what kind of assistance and who can be assisted. Syria is one of the areas where I've spent the majority of my time, not physically obviously, working over the last few years in trying to look at it much more on a justice side rather than a political transition, just because it is very difficult at this stage to have any viable political opposition that can be in place to implement some form of change, and I don't think that we've advanced very far, and I think the confused policies of the West has contributed to a lack of a cohesive strategy, and here we are, no further forward than we were 3 years ago.
There's one difference, Josh, if I can go to you, there's one difference, and that is the possible reaching out to Iran. And this is something that we haven't seen for 3 decades. And we have the terrible mess going on in the Middle East, but we still have some kind of communication with Tehran. I think that's a really interesting irony.
Well, it is. But before I talk about Iran, let me jump in and say it's very easy to blame much of what's going on the West and its confused policies, and they certainly have been very contradictory over the decades. But I think it's important to underline that much of this is going to rest with the Middle Easterners themselves. They have to find a way out of this. Their populations have become too big. In many ways, this is like Central Europe after World War I. The great powers drew lines after the empires were destroyed. And in Europe, there were 17 new nation states after World War I. In the Middle East, there were many as well. And the peoples were not reorganized to fit with the national borders that were drawn. And what we saw during the Second World War is an extremely bloody process in which minorities were destroyed, and the great sorting out is what I've called it, of people
Joshua,
fitting
it's very
their
important.
polling.
I mean, do you forecast that in the Middle East, the great sorting out? Because you're essentially saying ethnic cleansing.
It's happening. It is what happening before our eyes. It is happening, ethnic cleansing. And we've seen it go on as people fight over whose nation it is. We are seeing minorities get destroyed. In some cases, the minorities have become the majority. In Palestine, Israel, the minority of Jews were able to destroy the majority of Palestinians and make themselves into the majority. And that's what we've been seeing. And Palestinians have been largely left stateless. But this process in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Syria has been going on. It's very painful. It's very bloody. And it's much like what happened in Central Europe, where Poland was 64% Polish before World War II. By the end of World War II, almost 100%. And Czechoslovakia, 23% minorities. By the end of World War II, they had been wiped out. The German Sudetens, the Jews, and so forth. And this nation-building process, which is extraordinarily painful and brutal, is taking place in the Middle East. And there are many losers. And I think the West is confused because there's really very little it could do. It tried to go into Iraq and rearrange a power sharing, and it failed miserably.
On that very depressing note, Joshua, we've run out of time. Many thanks to my guests in London and in Norman, and thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, crosstalk rules.
I see. I love you.